All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melissa Varga. I'm the Science Network Community Manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'd like to welcome you again and thank you for joining us today for an online training on balancing your career and your interest in advocacy and public engagement. Today's webinar features experts who have overcome different types of barriers in their careers to speak out about the issues that they care about. So you'll hear from each of them about their experiences and advice that they have for how you can advocate or speak out in different ways, whether you are interested in working in academia, the federal government, or you're exploring a different career path. So we will hear from each of our speakers, and then there will be time for questions at the end, as well as a few opportunities that you can pursue in your free time. And if you are on Twitter, I encourage you to join in the conversation online by following @SciNetUCS, that's the Science Network Twitter handle, or using hashtag SciNetWorkshop. So I'd like to briefly introduce you to our speakers today. First up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Andrew Rosenberg, who has graciously stepped in at the last minute to speak to us about restrictions on how federal employees can approach advocacy and public engagement. And Andy is currently the director for the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And before that, he served as the Northeast Regional Administrator of the National Marine Fisheries Service at NOAA. Next, we should be joined by Dr. Aradhna Tripati, Director of the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science and Professor at UCLA. She is running a bit late, but we hope she's able to join us to share some advice for academics about resources to look for and how to integrate public engagement into your academic career. And then finally, we will hear from Joel Clement, a climate whistleblower and former federal executive at the Department of the Interior. Joel will speak from firsthand experience about knowing your rights as a federal employee and steps to take and resources to look for if you feel those rights are being violated. So we have a wonderful slate of speakers for you today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy. So take it away, Andy.
Thank you, Melissa. Hopefully the webcam is working. Well, thanks very much and welcome everyone. I'm going to go through do's and don'ts for federal employees, but I should note that many of these apply to scientists wherever you work, government employees at various levels, as well as many academics, but I'll specifically be talking about federal employees and your ability to speak out as an advocate. So what can you do as a federal employee or a government employee in any setting? Well, of course, you can do your best science and you can talk about it. There are scientific integrity policies in place in 26 federal agencies that are specifically protect your ability to speak about the science that you do, your ability to speak to the press, and to connect to people on social media speaking as a scientist, to talk about your science, not necessarily to give your opinion on everything that an agency does. And so you need to be careful to talk about the science that you're doing and the scientific evidence that you and your colleagues have developed without necessarily making a statement specifically about agency position, and I'll come back to that in a minute. You also can advocate for the things that you care about on your own time. When you get your degree or when you join the federal government or any other government agency, you do not check your citizenship at the door. You don't give up your rights as a citizen. So on your own time and using your own resources, you can speak and engage in issues you care about. You can participate in the March for Science. You can participate in UCS watchdog groups or science network activities on your own time and being very careful to make sure that you are using personal resources and personal time, not your employer's time. You can take careful notes and retain those notes for your own records. That's an important thing to do because in the current climate, it may be the case that people are asking you not to take notes in meetings. We've heard some of that from within the federal government, but you certainly can, if you like, make a note for the record within your own records and retain those carefully so that you have a record of what went on in the meetings you attended and what you not only said but observed, and to try to do it as soon after the meeting as possible, date and sign the notes, and keep them in your own files. There is nothing that prohibits you from making those kinds of records. You should, if immediately alert human resources if you believe that somebody is behaving inappropriately. You can also talk to the Inspector General's office if you believe there's inappropriate behavior. And in this case, I'm talking specifically about somebody trying to influence, bully, change, or in some way intimidate you so that you say something else about your science than what you believe the evidence would support. So you should be careful to go, I mean, sometimes you can go to your supervisor, but if you can't, you should go to HR and ask for their guidance. You certainly can speak on any issue, vote, advocate on your own time, and you should take great care on government email, but your private email, as long as you're not using it for official business, is your own. And you want to be very careful what you communicate on email because that is subject to Records Act as well as certainly a subpoena, congressional investigations, and other things. So you want to make sure that on your official email you're being careful in what you say and in what you do, and that you're not using your private email for official business. What shouldn't you do? Well, one of those things is don't use your private resources for official business. You should not speak for the agency unless you are authorized to do so. So you should not say, well, on behalf of, my agency, this is what our position is, unless you are authorized to do this so specifically. So if you care about an issue, you're speaking out about an issue, you're participating as a citizen in any activities, you should make a careful disclaimer that you're not speaking on behalf of the agency, that you are speaking in your personal capacity and as a scientist, but not as an agency scientist in that case, as a trained scientist who has experience in a particular issue. You should never fail to make that disclaimer if you're speaking in front of a crowd, if you're engaging at a local level. You don't want to go and give a community talk and have people believe that you are representing your agency when in fact you are not, or you're not authorized to do so. You should never use government resources for other than official duties. You need to be careful what that means. That means a government phone, government computers, any other resources. If you're traveling on government business and you're not on personal time, you need to be very careful on how you engage. So you need to be respectful of the distinction between private resources and government resources, and working on the government's time versus working on your personal time, vacation time, or others. You should never attack other agency staff for speaking out. That's just not a place you want to go with regard to your own activities. You don't want to make this personal with other staff. If you have a complaint to make against other staff, you should do it through proper channels. You don't want to do that publicly. You, as a private citizen, can say you believe that something is wrong, but I would stay away from attacking another staff person specifically as in your personal capacity when you work in a given agency. And of course, you should always be mindful of behaving professionally. And so you do not want to behave unprofessionally, in other words, in a way that you think brings any discredit or somehow would raise your concerns about whether you are actually acting appropriately as a scientist, as a citizen, and as an agency employee. You want to be very careful there. Now, there are resources to help understand your rights and also defend you if you feel like you're being targeted. And unfortunately, that is happening all too often with political targeting of some agency employees. UCS has something called the Scientist Protection Project, which you should avail yourself of, that connects you with law firms that will work on a pro bono basis to advise you of your rights, and if they feel you have specific legal action you should take, they would advise you. You should be careful how you communicate. If you want to communicate with Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, or with me about a confidential issue, I can't protect you if we were subpoenaed, for example, as a journalist could or as a lawyer could. But through the Scientist Protection Project, there are anonymous ways to communicate with UCS and ways that we can then connect you with either journalists or lawyers who have a First Amendment shield or attorney-client privilege shield. But UCS as an organization can't say, well, we're not going to reveal our sources because we don't have any protections as journalists. Of course, you can talk to us if you're not concerned about being identified. I would note that many newspapers, many other media outlets also have the ability of you to connect with them anonymously. In fact, we frequently get requests to connect journalists to agency employees or scientists working within a field. You can do that anonymously, and ultimately, if you decide you do want to be a source, they will protect you as a source as part of their journalist procedures and journalistic ethics. You, of course, want to do that with journalists and media associations that you know something about. You want to be very careful of somebody just approaching you from, an unknown source that you've never heard of and saying, I'd like to interview you. There are some scams out there, so you always want to be careful. There are other organizations that also try to help and support federal employees, public employees. Environmental responsibility is one. The union is another. The Federal Employees Union, the SES Association, all can provide you some advice, and they all have a different take on what they feel action you might want to take if you feel you need support. But most importantly, I think, please realize that you do have rights as a private citizen to speak out. Now, the final thing I'll say is that it's really important for scientists to, as appropriate, separate out what we believe is the scientific evidence and what it means from a policy prescription that I might have or you might have. And so as you talk about particular issues, try to the best of your ability to separate out those things. So, what is the evidence on a particular issue, a conservation issue, a pollution issue, a public health issue? What do we know about the public health impacts, for example? And what do we think those public health impacts mean in a broader context is separate from, therefore, this agency should take this action or the government as a whole should take a particular action. I think it's important for people to recognize that scientists have those views, but they can separate out the idea of what their scientific evidence is, and I mean not just from your own work, but broadly in the scientific literature, from what you believe the right policy is or should be. And the reason that I say that is you want to maintain your credentials as a scientist, and I know prior to the webinar, people had questions about, how do you maintain your credibility? One way you do that is to be explicit about what the weight of evidence is, and then when you're offering an opinion, which is not a matter of science, but is a matter of societal choice. If you distinguish those things, I think it's important for your own credibility in the public debate. So I think, Melissa, I'm not sure how long I've gone on, but that should be about the amount of time allocated, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. And with that, we're going to transition now to Dr. Tripati, who's going to speak a little bit more from the academic perspective. So do you mind turning on your webcam and sharing your story?
Great. I'm not sure. Let's see, there we go. Start the webcam. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, I don't know how many people here have heard about a famous poem by Martin Niemöller. He was a German Lutheran pastor who was a public foe of Adolf Hitler's. And it seems as timely now as it ever has. This is a poem I heard about 20 years ago, and it really has stuck with me. And, you know, it speaks, well, let me just say the poem first. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So this poem is really about the cowardice of intellectuals in Germany, basically after the rise of Hitler and their purging of different groups. I bring this up because I think it is really as important now as it has ever been to be an academic, to be a scientist, to be an intellectual, and to also be an activist on issues, be they societal issues that relate to diversity or issues that directly relate to the science that you might practice. For example, I'm a climate scientist, and I speak out about both of these issues. There's really no reason to muzzle yourself, to speak out scientifically in areas that are your expertise, and to speak out as a human being, as an intellectual on other issues. I do think that it's important to think about how to be safe and strategic, as the previous speaker mentioned, and to also think about what you really think is inappropriate, harmful, and to think about how one frames it. I also want to emphasize that, just from my own experiences as a climate scientist and as a woman of color in science for the last 25 years, what I've definitely seen is that it really is that nobody else's job, even if there are other groups that we think of as being present to advocate for these issues. Nobody is going to come to save us when it comes to climate change. Nobody, we can't necessarily count on a Title IX office to come and help us when it comes to issues relating to diversity. We can't just pass the buck and expect for somebody else to be active and engaged. Really, it's important for us to see this as everybody's job, really, to be kind of an activist when it comes to these issues. I think it's important for all of us to work to make it safe for everybody to speak up, whether they're a junior scientist or a senior scientist in a democratic society. Something that I recall from when I was in graduate school is the hearing from my advisor in a very different perspective. And I think his message, the contrast with mine, really does speak to generational change in norms in the scientific community. What I see more senior scientists sometimes saying is that it's important to wait until you're senior, to wait until you have tenure. But, I think what we are now all appreciating increasingly is that there's an incredible amount of damage that can be done to you and to others if you take that approach. And that, in fact, there's kind of a chilling muzzling that can occur if you decide you're going to just wait and not speak up. It's analogous to the people, being said, people were said to Rosa Parks, sit on the back of the bus until, things get better so you can sit in the front. When it comes to issues relating to diversity and equity in science, I think that analogy is very apt. And when I think about climate change and other environmental issues, I also feel like we really don't have time to wait. In terms of kind of framing of messages that we send when we're in the public eye, I think it's important to remember that what people see is not something that necessarily reflects your intent. So you have to really kind of think about the audience you're engaging with and act strategically. Sometimes it helps to come up with your message and talk to other people about it to make sure that you really are getting across the message you want to get across. I think it's also important to think about, whether you're acting whether you're acting solely out of self-interest or would be perceived to be acting out of self-interest, or in the public interest solely, or both. And I actually think if you can be perceived as acting in both, that's actually the most compelling to people. I think that it's also really effective when you can connect with people by telling personal stories or anecdotes that are also backed up with real data, with statistics. Those types of stories can actually have the strongest impact when one is engaging as an advocate. So I think I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it over to Joel. If you wouldn't mind hitting start my webcam and share, and that way we can all see you.
Okay, I'm trying to start my webcam, but I'm not sure it's working. Let me know when and if you can see me. All right, is that working?
Still waiting.
Okay, I see that it's on. Oh, hang on. Got it. Okay.
There we go.
How are we doing? All right, thanks very much, Melissa. And my apologies for taking a second there. I'm delighted to be on here talking with you all. This is a great topic, obviously important to me now, and I'm glad to have some good participation on this webinar. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, and it's going to be less about advocacy and more about just doing your job, right? And I think sometimes we confuse the two. We're not being advocates if we're just trying to do our job effectively, and there are times when we're not allowed to do that. So my story that I'm going to tell represents what you can do in that eventuality, and then what the resources are that are available to you. So I'm going to very briefly go through my story, and then I'm going to make a little pitch at the end for federal service. So I came into federal service in an unusual way. I was a forest canopy biologist. I was studying the plants that grow in the tops of trees years ago, but at a certain point, I think like many of you, I wanted to get into the applications of my work and ultimately get into problem solving. And so I worked for a private foundation for a little while on Western public lands and worked on climate adaptation issues and bridging science and policy matters. And then it was it was not a big transition then to go into the federal government and do the same thing from within. So I was the director of the Office of Policy Analysis at Interior. The Department of Interior, as many of you know, encompasses many very diverse and different bureau missions, everything from the Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service to USGS, and of course the agencies that lease lands onshore and offshore for oil and gas. So there's a lot of white hats and black hats in that agency. So we worked on those cross-cutting issues and we informed the Office of the Secretary and the White House on these issues. I had economists and analysts and scientists on my staff there. Climate change, of course, was a big issue, a big focus for me, and I became the lead career climate guy there, and particularly focused on the plight of the Alaska Natives in the Arctic, in those villages, and many of you are aware of this. There are villages up there on the coastlines, on these narrow spits and islands. They were not there of their own choosing initially, but many decades ago, that's where they've settled, that's where the infrastructure is. And right now, because the permafrost is melting and the sea ice doesn't set in before the storm season, they're in danger every year also from river erosion. So really, in a tough situation up there, it's a responsibility of the federal government to help ameliorate that, and that was one of my jobs at Interior. And even when the election went the way it did in 2016, I wasn't too worried. I thought, well, climate change adaptation, everybody has to deal with these impacts that are before us. We know how they feel about climate change causes and so on, but obviously we'll still be working on this stuff. And of course, I was naive about that and quite wrong. And what followed was it was kind of an all-out assault on anything that kind of had the whiff of climate change. And for that matter, anything that the previous administration had touched. And as folks here at Union of Concerned Scientists have noted over and over, scientists and experts were being marginalized right from the outset. So there was a series of kind of ham-fisted punches at experts. And one of those punches landed on the Senior Executive Service, of which I was a part. And the senior executives, or SES folks, are they're high-level but non-political expertise that's brought in to work in particular offices or bureaus at a leadership level. We report generally to the political appointees. And every administration, when they come in, they move a few of these folks around for various different reasons. But no agency in any administration has ever come in and moved dozens at once in one night, as this administration did. And I was part of that. And a lot of these folks, they all had families. Many were retirement age. Many were American Indians, so there was an element of discrimination. These things all took place in a very short period of time with very little explanation. No one heard of it beforehand. And so it clearly led to some consternation, particularly on the Hill. 8 senators signed a letter to the Inspector General at Interior saying, what gives? Because Secretary Zinke, who had been the only Senate-confirmed employee, Secretary Ryan Zinke, at Interior at the time, had just been up to the Hill testifying that, yes, indeed, he intended to use these reassignments of the SES folks to trim the DOI workforce by thousands of people. And I think for anyone that thinks about it for a second, a reassignment doesn't trim the workforce. So it was clear they were trying to dislodge people from the workforce, and of course that's unlawful. So there he was confessing this up on the Hill. So they grew very curious and have started an investigation through the Inspector General at Interior. I, in particular, was clearly in the crosshairs. It may have been because of my focus on climate change. I had been very vocal about the perils that climate change poses, particularly for these Alaska Natives in the Arctic, and my belief is that is why they reassigned me. So this, of course, led to all kinds of problems at the agency. I'm not going to go into much detail other than to say that it was an immense waste of resources, my salary and other things, to put me in a job that I knew nothing about. This is why I knew they wanted me to quit. They moved me to a job in the office that collects and disperses royalty income from oil and gas and mining industries. So it was pretty clear what they were trying to do with me. So not only does it create this waste and this bad governance, but it leaves these Alaska Natives in particular without anyone in D.C. organizing the federal response. So it had a direct impact on the health and safety of Americans, and that is, we'll get back to that and what constitutes a whistleblower complaint. As a result of all that, because for those folks in Alaska, this is not a policy debate, right? This is a life or death thing, and they are in a tough situation up there. So I not only filed a whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel, but I went public with that in the Washington Post. Some of you may have read my op-ed back in July, saying, "Hey, this is an abuse of power. This is inappropriate, and it leaves some Americans in a very vulnerable situation." That made me the first public whistleblower of the Trump administration. So it was quite a big response, not only from those senators that I mentioned, but a group of legal scholars also wrote a letter to the Office of Special Counsel on my behalf saying, hey, this is dangerously close to politicizing the civil service. And as Andy has said and others, there's a line in the sand there between the political appointees and the civil service. We're here in the civil service to implement the laws. We're loyal to the Constitution and to the mission of the agencies, but we're not meant to be pledging allegiance to the political appointees that come in. So We have to be careful about that line. I'm going to keep saying we, even though I'm no longer there. In October, I tendered my resignation again very publicly as an opportunity to say, hey, what's happening now at this agency is inappropriate. So what is a whistleblower? I submitted this complaint and was, the investigation is ongoing now, by the way. I was accepted as a whistleblower because it was a legitimate complaint. Because their action to reassign me, after I'd been very vocal about these threats to the Alaska Natives, prevented me from doing that work. So there's an implication for the health and safety of Alaska Natives. And in fact, they've been doing very little for those folks in general since then. So that's one of the types of whistleblower hooks that there are, legal hooks, is that if American health and safety is jeopardized. Now, others are what are called prohibited personnel practices that Andy alluded to. And that's discrimination based on race, sex, gender, country of origin, and so on. Those complaints also can be submitted and can become whistleblower complaints. Those go to the Merit System Protection Board. So these are the kinds of hooks that are out there for federal employees that, frankly, I knew nothing about. And I think, like most of you, I know what the term means, but I didn't know what the protections were for federal employees, and certainly don't know what they are for in other employment situations. So that's why webinars like this, I think, are so important and helpful. But as a federal employee, of course, you do have these protections. The Whistleblower Protection Act and the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, just from a few years ago, provide certain protections if you feel you've been either discriminated against or if there's a risk to American health and safety. So Andy referred to a lot of the resources out there and some of the do's and don'ts, but I will say that as someone who's been through this and knew nothing about it, you really need to talk to legal help. You really need to find an attorney that knows something about employment law or scientific integrity. Andy mentioned the Science Protection Project here at the Union of Concerned Scientists. That's a fantastic resource because they can refer you to legal help. But just have that conversation. I would say that to anyone that has any concern about their employment situation or potentially has those kinds of concerns, because the more you know, the more you can feel free to act as you feel you should. Again, I'm not even talking about advocacy right here now. I'm talking about being able to do your job and implement, for example, the mission of your agency. It may be how you spend grant dollars and things like that, too. So there are some great resources out there in that general whistleblower space, not just for scientists. The Government Accountability Project, or GAP, is a good resource. They've done a lot of this work. The Project on Government Oversight, POGO, is also a great resource. They're keeping track of a lot of these things. But the other thing that I think is relevant to the folks on this call are the scientific integrity policies of the various different agencies. And those are dynamic. They may change over time, but there are policies in place that are meant to ensure or minimize political interference in science, and paying attention to those is, I think, very important. And for example, at the EPA right now, we've seen a lot of violations of their scientific integrity policy. I also would suggest that there have been a lot of opportunities for whistleblower complaints at EPA because of all the agencies. Their regulatory role, their responsibility for the health and safety of Americans is essential. I think there probably are a number of ways that scientists and others at EPA could, in fact, file whistleblower complaints. So I advocate that folks do find legal help. I'm here as a senior fellow at UCS, and I'm available to refer folks to people like that. But I do suggest people reach out and do that. I think we want to leave a good amount of time for questions, so I won't go on. But that's sort of a brief recap of my story, how I became a whistleblower, and then what next. So please, Melissa, take it from here, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Joel, and thank all of you so much for sharing your story and perspectives and some resources to check out. Before we dive into questions, I wanted to take an opportunity to share an example of some of the opportunities that are out there for you to explore if you're interested in advocacy and public engagement. So you should see a poll on your screen. These are a few of the opportunities through UCS that we have active right now. So there's a bipartisan group of legislators who recently introduced a new Farm Bill proposal aiming to boost local and regional food systems, and it's called the Local Food and Regional Market Supply Act, or FARMS Act. If you are interested in sustainable food access and sustainable food issues, feel free to check that option. And for all of these, we will follow up with more information on how you can get more involved. A few state-based opportunities. In Washington, if you have expertise related to transportation, there are opportunities to testify and write support letters on issues related to electric vehicles, fuels, and freight. And then in Oregon, experts can testify and write support letters for the cap-and-trade bill. So both the Washington and Oregon state legislatures are only in session for about a month after this, so these are urgent and timely issues. Additionally, there are impactful ways you can support your local community without specifically advocating on or for specific pieces of legislation. And UCS created a guide on building scientist community partnerships that we'd be happy to send you on ways to offer support to local community groups. So we'd be happy to send that to you as well. Again, feel free to check any of these options and we can follow up with you afterwards. I'm going to end this poll right now though, so we can hear a bit more from our presenters and answer some of the questions that have already been sent in and some of the questions that you've been sending in through the questions box already. So Aradhna, Andy, and Joel, if you want to turn on your webcams, I'm going to turn mine off right now, and we can start taking questions from all of you who have joined us today. We're going to start with one that was sent in advance. How can faculty teach and encourage activism in students and trainees? Aradhna, if you would like to turn on your webcam, maybe we could start with you.
Sure. So there are a few ways that I think you can encourage this. Firstly, I think it's important for us to model this, right, for people that we work with, for our trainees. So that means doing the work, but also that we do whilst at the same time engaging in activism, and then talking with people in our group about it. I send emails out about kind of relevant opportunities that relate to public engagement. I also encourage other people in my group too. Think about other things. You know, another thing I've done is in classes that I've taught, I've introduced kind of a broader impacts, science communication / public advocacy type project. And so then I give them examples of what they might do and then have this be part of the class. In upper division classes, I also talk about, have a debate, really, a discussion about what the role of scientists should be in society today and how this has historically evolved. And then we get to actually hear kind of diverse perspectives from early career trainees on this and have an opportunity to hear their perspectives and offer feedback on them. I know of some faculty who actually do things like, set aside 5 or 10 minutes at faculty meeting, at their group meetings for letter writing to engage in kind of climate science advocacy into the political process. So those are kind of a handful of different examples of ways that I think we can do this.
Maybe, Melissa, if I could just add to that as a former faculty member. I also think it's important to bring in speakers on different issues who can talk about different kinds of activism. that are coming from different organizations, not just academics as speakers, but people who can talk about what's happening at a local level on particular issues to sort of bring your students and trainees into the discussion. I also think it's really helpful for people to not only get some practice at speaking to a general audience, but then get some opportunity to actually try it out. So communications training is great, but sometimes there are relatively low risk opportunities to practice, talking to a reporter. Maybe you don't want to send your students out to talk to, a major newspaper, but if there are other outlets, give somebody else an opportunity to participate in an interview and get a little bit of experience, or come to meetings, with elected officials. And then I think connection to various groups, whether it's 500 Women Scientists, UCS, many, many different environmental groups, local advocacy groups, just encouraging people to go and listen. It's not always, as a scientist, about going and presenting information. A lot of times it's just about going and listening to the concerns in your community and trying to understand how that relates to what you know about science and and the particular work that you're doing.
Great. We have a question that came in for Joel. Knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently during the Obama administration to make you less of a target in the new administration?
Thanks for that question. Absolutely not. In fact, I found myself challenged by even the Obama administration trying to get to where we needed to be on climate change adaptation. Those of us that work on the impacts of climate change and how we're going to handle those know that we're way behind in preparation. And I wanted to get way out ahead of where the Obama administration was, even because it wasn't until the second term, really, that because Congress controls the purse strings, it wasn't until the second term that people were willing to start talking openly about it. I was raring to go much sooner than that. So I wouldn't. I think it's the job of government and the civil service to look out for American health and safety, but also for the ecosystems and lands that we are put in charge of. And so I guess I'm just not the type that would voluntarily censor myself in order to stay out of trouble going down the road. I will say that there is certainly a lot of that going on now. A lot of people are trying to stay out of the crosshairs by censoring themselves, and I think there's even a fine line there. I think a lot of good work doesn't happen because of that self-censorship. So I do think it's important for scientists in the federal context to think carefully about that. Obviously, there are career considerations, and you have to put those first. But where I'm sitting, no, Bonnie, I would not have done anything differently. If I could have, I would have done more on that front.
Thanks for that. Another question that was sent in advance that I think could apply for any scientist. How do you recommend handling our public images on social media, both personal and professional accounts? So places like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Any thoughts on how to navigate those or approach those?
That's actually a pretty tough question. It depends on what you're using those social platforms for. If you expect you want to reach an audience as a scientist and as a professional, I don't think you can mix that in very effectively with a lot of personal stuff. I have to say that working in an advocacy organization, which has a communications department, I use, even though I'm not on Facebook, I am on Twitter, as Melissa knows. I try to take a deep breath and think about what the head of communications who sits next door to me would say before I hit the post button. And a fair amount of time I'd say, well, maybe I'll just delete that. Because, Twitter's good for being snarky, but you don't want to come across as so unprofessional that people will dismiss your comments out of hand. And so I think it's very difficult to mix the personal and the, sort of Facebook or Twitter interactions with your friends with also speaking out as a scientist and wanting to have some credibility because of your knowledge, and not just go into the general, discussion as, any other person is posting and try to have a profile. Others may have different viewpoints, but I also think that's the same for faculty. I think a lot of faculty can get into trouble by, sort of mixing personal and their faculty comments as a faculty member.
I'd agree with Andy. And the thing that I keep telling myself when I'm on Twitter is stay in your lane, Joel. Just stay in your lane, because there are just people that feel it's okay to voice their opinions on absolutely everything. And I'm brand new to Twitter. I didn't get on Twitter until I published that op-ed in the Washington Post, and it was, it's part of my platform now. It's how I reach out on the issues I care about. But everybody doesn't want to know how I feel about the latest BS that's taken place in D.C. If it's not something that's related to my area of expertise, I'm just going to hold back. I slip up. I think everybody does from time to time. But for the most part, that's my mantra. Stay in your lane. If you don't know much about it, try not to.
Interesting. I guess I have a related view, but maybe it's different in some nuanced ways. I use Twitter and Facebook quite a lot, and I have several different goals in my account. Part of it relates to my advocacy agenda as a climate scientist and as a proponent for diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM. But at the same time, I also use it as a way to network with other people who are like-minded, some of whom are, similar career stage to me, some of whom are more senior, and some of whom are also more junior. And then I also use it as a means for communicating with friends, as a way of kind of challenging stereotypes of what a scientist is. I also try to demonstrate that, in fact, I do have a human side, and I do have interests, I do have thoughts about politics, and so I guess the tone of my messages might be different depending on what I'm specifically posting about. I might post pictures with family or repost a cat picture, things like this, of course, as well. So I do actually use it for personal purposes as well as for advocacy purposes. I do know that there are some people who actually keep separate accounts. They'll kind of curate a more professional account, and then they'll also curate kind of a personal account so that they can use these social media accounts in different ways. And they really kind of spend a lot of time thinking about their brand, particularly for professional purposes. And I think that can be an effective way to go as well. But I guess I would say, if you're trying to figure out how to use your social media accounts, just think long and hard about what they represent to you. Because if they're a source of support for you and you need this as a space to, kind of to talk about things that you think are important, even if they may not necessarily be in the majority view. For example, let's say with diversity and equity and your personal experiences with them, I think it's really important to be able to use them in that way. So yeah, it seems to me that a lot depends on where exactly you're coming from.
I don't think I disagree with any of that, but I also always remember that this stuff is permanent. It lives forever. So if to take a deep breath before you post is still worthwhile, even if you're doing it in that context. But everybody has to make that decision for themselves. I
strongly advocate for taking several deep breaths. Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, so feel free to keep sending them in. We got a question from Daniel that I'm going to try to sum up. It was about how can you effectively advocate for diversity in STEM while trying to maintain that balance and scientific credibility. Aradhna, would you like to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a few ways to do it. I think in terms of advocating for diversity in STEM whilst maintaining scientific credibility, just with the posing of the question, I appreciate where you're coming from. I don't think they need to be viewed as being in conflict. In fact, there's quite a bit of literature out there on the benefits for science of being inclusive, of promoting diversity. In fact, having kind of a narrow set of perspectives only being representative in science is actually really unhealthy for the field. For any field, you tend to get confirmation bias, and you don't, in fact, tend to spur creativity or innovation in the same way. And this is recognized not just in the scientific enterprise, but also in the business enterprise. So I'm more than happy to kind of follow up with that and send some materials to Melissa, or I just encourage you to kind of consider searching online for that information. But I think being armed with data is helpful. I also think we could all agree that we don't think that science should just be for a few privileged people, that in fact science is for everybody. We're all born being scientists when we're kids, right? And in fact, that it's more important now than ever for the public to have an appreciation for science and its benefits for everybody. So, I think we need to think of diversity not in and of itself, but as diversity signaling and of inclusion and the health of a field, and fairness, and that those are things that everybody can get behind.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all of those comments. I'd also say that if you want to do really good science, then is it not
I can see
through?
Andrew's talking, but Andrew, you're.
I can hear you. Okay.
Okay. I was just going to say, if you're going to do really good science, then you need to think of things from as many perspectives as possible. And so I also, while I certainly agree science is not for just a few or a privileged few, it also means that you need to be considering, what questions need to be asked from perspectives you may not have thought about or perspectives you may not have experienced. And that's true in many, many areas of science. So actually even formulating the questions, deciding what we're going to work on as scientists needs to involve a much broader spectrum of society than simply perhaps the way that we've done things in the past. And so there are many, many instances of science going off track because of not actually considering not only the rights of various peoples, but the perspective of those peoples and the questions that were really important to them, including the kinds of things that Joel was talking about with Native Alaskan communities affected by climate change. It would be easy to just ignore those and say, well, that's not a central issue for science. Well, it certainly is. And so I don't think there's any conflict between considering diversity, both in participation as well as in perspectives in our scientific work.
I think that's a really helpful reframing and topic to end on. And since we are close to the top of the hour, I'd like to start wrapping up and share some of the next steps with you. So I'm going to email you a copy of the recording of this webinar along with a lot of the related resources that were mentioned today, so you can have those afterwards. If you indicated in the poll that you're interested in getting more involved with UCS on some of the opportunities that we shared, we will send you more information about that as well. And as always, if you have questions for UCS or for the Science Network, you can get involved or reach out to us through sciencенetwork@ucsusa.org. That's our email, or on Twitter @SciNetUCS. I would encourage you to check out some of those web resources that were mentioned today as well, like the Science Protection Project. With that, I want to thank all of our speakers once again, and thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you on our next webinar in March.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.